Right now, your sensory systems are collecting far more information than you consciously notice. Light is entering your eyes. Sound waves are moving through the air. Receptors in your skin are responding to pressure and temperature. Your inner ear is tracking the position of your head, while chemical receptors help create the experiences you call taste and smell. But detecting stimulation is only the beginning. Your brain still has to organize that information, decide what deserves attention, and build it into a meaningful experience. That is why two people can receive nearly the same sensory information and still notice, interpret, or remember the situation differently. In this video, we are working through 90 sensation and perception terms every psychology student should know. We will begin with psychophysics and sensory detection, move through vision, hearing, and the other senses, and then examine how the brain organizes depth, motion, patterns, and attention. For each term, you will see a concise definition and hear a real-life example. Do not stop at memorizing the wording. Pause when you need to, explain the idea in your own words, and ask yourself how the same concept might appear in a different situation. That application step matters in both introductory psychology and the modern AP psychology course.
Welcome back to the Psychology Notebook. I'm Desiree, and this video is part of my Psychology Study Resource Series, where I cover hundreds of psychology terms to help you learn the science of psychology. Most terminology videos use my AI-assisted voice to keep the audio clear and easy to follow, especially for viewers studying psychology around the world. For more classroom-style lessons with my natural teaching voice, check out the full Psych 101 series and the lecture playlist for on-camera and behind-the-scenes content. Now, let's get into today's terms.
Before we separate vision from hearing or taste from touch, we need a basic framework. These first terms explain how physical energy becomes a psychological experience, how researchers measure sensory limits, and why detecting something depends on more than the stimulus alone. 1. Sensation. Sensation is the process through which sensory receptors detect physical stimulation and send information toward the nervous system. Light activates receptors in the eyes. Sound vibrations activate receptors in the inner ear. Pressure, temperature, and tissue damage activate different receptors throughout the body. Imagine that your phone vibrates against your hand. Receptors in your skin detect the movement before you decide what it means. That initial detection is sensation. Sensation gives the brain raw information to work with, but it does not, by itself, explain how that information becomes a recognizable object or event. That next step is perception. 2. Perception. Perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information so it becomes meaningful. Sensation detects the stimulation. Perception helps you recognize what produced it. If you hear a series of notes, sensation begins with receptors responding to sound waves. Perception allows you to recognize the notes as the opening of a familiar song. Your brain combines the incoming information with context, expectations, and prior knowledge. This is the central distinction for the entire video. Sensation is about receiving information. Perception is about making sense of it. 3. Transduction. Transduction is the conversion of one form of physical energy into neural signals the brain can process. Sensory receptors do not send light, pressure, or sound waves directly through the nervous system. They translate that energy into electrochemical activity. In vision, photoreceptors in the retina respond to light. In hearing, movement inside the cochlea bends hair cells. In both cases, the original physical energy is changed into a neural message. Think of transduction as translation. The stimulus begins in the language of the physical world. Sensory receptors convert it into the language of the nervous system. 4. Psychophysics. Psychophysics is the study of relationships between the physical properties of stimuli and the psychological experiences they produce. Researchers might change the brightness of a light, the volume of a tone, or the weight of an object and measure what a person can detect. For example, adding one candle to a dark room may create a noticeable difference. Adding one candle to a brightly lit stadium probably will not. The physical change is the same, but the psychological experience is different. Psychophysics connects measurable stimulation in the environment with what people actually notice, discriminate, and report. 5. Absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum level of stimulation a person can detect 50% of the time. The 50% rule matters because sensory detection is not perfectly consistent. Imagine hearing a very faint tone through headphones. At one volume, you may notice it on some trials and miss it on others. The point where you detect it in about half of the trials is your absolute threshold for that tone under those conditions. An absolute threshold is not the weakest stimulus a person could ever detect. It is the level that produces reliable detection half of the time. 6. Difference. Threshold, or just noticeable difference. The difference threshold, also called the just noticeable difference, is the smallest difference between two stimuli that a person can detect 50% of the time. Suppose you are holding a backpack and someone adds small weights one at a time. At first, you may not notice a change. Eventually, the backpack feels heavier. The smallest reliably noticed change is the difference threshold. The absolute threshold asks, can you detect the stimulus at all? The difference threshold asks, can you tell that the stimulus has changed? 7. Weber's law. Weber's law states that the size of a just noticeable difference depends on a constant proportion of the original stimulus, rather than one fixed amount. The stronger the original stimulus, the larger the change usually needs to be before you notice it. Adding 1 pound to a 5-pound bag may be obvious. Adding 1 pound to a 100-pound load may not be. The amount added is identical, but its proportion is very different. Weber's law explains why sensory comparisons depend on where you started. A noticeable change is relative to the original intensity.
8. Signal detection theory. Signal detection theory explains how people decide whether a faint signal is present when there is also uncertainty or background noise. Detection depends on sensory sensitivity, but it also depends on expectations, attention, motivation, and the consequences of being wrong. A radiologist examining an image may be more likely to report a possible abnormality when missing it could be dangerous. A tired student waiting for a text may think a random vibration came from the phone. Signal detection theory separates the ability to detect information from the decision rule a person uses when deciding whether the signal was there. 9. Hidden signal detection theory. A hit occurs when a signal is present and the person correctly detects it. Imagine airport security equipment screening a bag. A prohibited object is inside and the screener identifies it. That response is a hit. The signal existed and the decision matched reality. Hits are correct detections. However, trying to increase the number of hits can also make a person more willing to say a signal is present, which may increase false alarms. Signal detection always involves a balance between sensitivity and decision-making. 10. Miss occurs when a signal is present, but the person fails to detect it. If a smoke detector does not sound even though smoke is in the room, that is a miss. The important information existed, but the system responded as if it did not. The seriousness of a miss depends on the situation. Missing a quiet notification may not matter. Missing a dangerous medical finding can matter greatly. When the cost of a miss is high, people and detection systems may adopt a more cautious response rule. 11. False alarm. A false alarm occurs when no signal is present, but the person reports detecting one. You are expecting an important message and feel your phone vibrate in your pocket. When you check, there is no notification. Your expectation made you more ready to interpret an uncertain sensation as the signal you were waiting for. A false alarm is not simply poor eyesight or hearing. It can reflect the decision threshold being used. Becoming more willing to detect possible signals can produce more hits, but it can also produce more false alarms. Receptors 12. Correct rejection. A correct rejection occurs when no signal is present and the person correctly decides that it is absent. Suppose a lifeguard notices an unusual shape in the water, checks carefully, and correctly determines that it is a floating toy rather than a swimmer in distress. There was no emergency signal, and the final judgment accurately rejected it. Together, hits, misses, false alarms, and correct rejections describe every possible outcome in a basic signal detection task. The signal can be present or absent, and the observer can say yes or no. 13. Sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is reduced sensitivity to a constant, unchanging stimulus over time. Sensory systems are especially responsive to change, so information that remains stable often fades from awareness. When you first enter a room with a strong scent, you may notice it immediately. After several minutes, the smell seems much weaker, even though other people entering the room can still detect it. The stimulus did not necessarily disappear. Your response to the continuing stimulation changed. Sensory adaptation helps free attention for new information that may be more important. 14. Sensory interaction. Sensory interaction occurs when information from one sense influences the experience of another. The senses work together more often than we realize. Flavor is a familiar example. Taste receptors respond to a small number of basic tastes, while smell contributes much of the complexity we experience as flavor. That is why food can seem unusually bland when your nose is congested. Vision can also influence what we think we hear, and sound can influence how we interpret a visual event. Sensory systems are distinct, but perception combines their information into a more unified experience.
15. Synesthesia. Synesthesia is a condition in which stimulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway automatically produces an additional experience in another pathway. A person might consistently experience certain letters as having specific colors or perceive musical notes as shapes. This is not the same as choosing a creative association. For someone with synesthesia, the added experience tends to occur automatically and remain stable over time. The letter A might always appear red, even when it is printed in black. Synesthesia shows that the boundaries between sensory experiences are not identical for every brain.
Want a better way to learn psychology? I created a free visual psychology starter guide to help you see how the major ideas connect. Inside, you'll find 25 illustrated psychology flashcards, colorful visual maps, and beginner-friendly explanations covering the brain, memory, learning, personality, development, and more. Whether you're taking a psychology class or just curious about how people think and behave, this guide gives you a simple place to start. Download your free copy using the link in the description.
Section 1. Review and transition. These first terms give us the basic pathway. Sensation detects stimulation. Transduction converts it into neural activity. Perception gives it meaning. Psychophysics measures the relationship between the physical stimulus and the experience, while signal detection theory explains why attention, expectation, and consequences can change the final decision. Now we can apply that framework to the sensory system people often rely on most heavily: vision. Section 2. Vision and color. Processing vision begins with light, but seeing is not a camera simply recording the world. The eye focuses light, receptors respond to different features, and the brain constructs color, form, depth, and recognizable objects from the resulting neural activity. 16. Wavelength. Wavelength is the distance from one peak of a light wave to the next. Within the visible spectrum, wavelength is closely related to the color or hue that a person experiences. Shorter visible wavelengths are generally experienced as blue or violet. Longer visible wavelengths are generally experienced as orange or red. Light outside the visible range exists, but human eyes do not respond to it as visible color. Wavelength is a physical property of light. Color is the perceptual experience the visual system creates from that information. 17. Retina. The retina is the light-sensitive layer of tissue at the back of the eye. It contains photoreceptors called rods and cones, along with additional cells that begin processing visual information before it leaves the eye. When you look at a page, light reflected from the paper passes through the eye and reaches the retina. Receptors respond to the pattern of light and begin the process of transduction. The retina is not simply a screen where a picture appears. It is living neural tissue that detects and begins to organize visual information. 18. Blind spot. The blind spot is the location on each retina where the optic nerve exits the eye. Because this area contains no rods or cones, light falling directly on it cannot be detected. Most people do not notice a hole in their visual field. With both eyes open, one eye often supplies information the other eye is missing. The brain can also fill in the gap using surrounding patterns and expectations. The blind spot demonstrates that perception is constructed. Your experience can feel complete even when the sensory information contains a genuine gap. 19. Lens. The lens is the transparent, flexible structure behind the iris that helps focus light onto the retina. It changes shape so that objects at different distances can be brought into focus. When you shift your gaze from a distant sign to a book in your hand, the pattern of light reaching the eye changes. The lens adjusts to help create a focused image on the retina. The lens does not detect light. Its job is to bend and focus light so the retina can respond to it clearly. 20. Accommodation. Accommodation is the process through which the eye changes the shape of the lens to focus on objects at different distances. Muscles around the lens alter its curvature depending on where you are looking. Hold one finger near your face and then look across the room. Your visual system quickly shifts focus from the nearby finger to the distant scene. That focusing adjustment is accommodation. This term also appears in Piaget's theory with a completely different meaning. In sensation and perception, accommodation refers specifically to the eye focusing through changes in the lens. 21. Myopia or nearsightedness. Myopia, commonly called nearsightedness, occurs when distant objects appear blurry because incoming light is focused in front of the retina rather than directly on it. This often happens when the eyeball is relatively long or the eye bends light too strongly. A student with myopia may read a phone clearly but struggle to see writing across the classroom. Corrective lenses help redirect the light so the image focuses on the retina. The memory cue is simple. Near objects are clearer in nearsightedness. The difficulty appears mainly with distance. 22. Hyperopia or farsightedness. Hyperopia, commonly called farsightedness, occurs when light would focus behind the retina. This often happens when the eyeball is relatively short or the eye does not bend light strongly enough. Depending on age and severity, nearby objects may be especially difficult to focus on. A person might hold a page farther away to make the print clearer. Myopia places the focal point in front of the retina and usually disrupts distance vision. Hyperopia places it behind the retina and often creates greater difficulty with near vision. 23. Rods. Rods are retinal photoreceptors that are highly sensitive in dim light. They contribute strongly to night vision and peripheral vision, but do not provide detailed color information. When you look directly at a faint star, it may seem to disappear. Looking slightly beside it can make it easier to see because more rods are located outside the central fovea. Rods are excellent for detecting low levels of light and movement at the edges of vision. Cones are better for fine detail and color. 24. Cones. Cones are retinal photoreceptors that work best in brighter light and support color vision and fine visual detail. They are concentrated most densely near the center of the retina, especially in the fovea. Reading small print and distinguishing colorful details in daylight depend heavily on cones. In very dim lighting, colors become difficult to identify because cones are not receiving enough light to function effectively. Rods help you detect that something is present in the dark. Cones help you see what it is in clear color and detail. 25. Fovea. The fovea is the small central region of the retina with the greatest concentration of cones and the highest visual acuity. When you look directly at a word or face, your eyes position its image near the fovea. Try reading a word while staring several inches beside it. You may still detect the word, but the letters are harder to identify clearly. Peripheral vision is useful for motion and broad information, while the fovea provides the sharp detail needed for careful inspection. The fovea is the point of clearest, most detailed vision. 26. Dark adaptation. Dark adaptation is the gradual increase in visual sensitivity that occurs after moving from a bright environment into darkness. Cones adjust first, while rods take longer to reach their greatest sensitivity. When you enter a dark movie theater, you may initially struggle to see the seats. After several minutes, the room becomes easier to navigate, even though the lighting has not changed. Your eyes are not creating more light. The visual system is becoming more sensitive to the limited light that is available. 27. Light adaptation. Light adaptation is the decrease in visual sensitivity that occurs after moving from darkness into a bright environment. The visual system adjusts, so intense light becomes more manageable. Leaving a dark theater on a sunny afternoon can feel uncomfortable at first. You may squint or shield your eyes, but the brightness soon becomes less overwhelming. Dark adaptation increases sensitivity when light is scarce. Light adaptation reduces sensitivity when light is abundant. Both processes help the visual system operate across very different conditions. 28. Trichromatic. Theory. Trichromatic theory proposes that color vision begins with three types of cones that are most sensitive to short, medium, or long wavelengths. The brain compares the activity across these cone types to produce the experience of many different colors. A screen can create a wide range of colors by combining red, green, and blue light in different proportions. The eye uses a related three-receptor system at the first stage of color processing. Trichromatic theory explains how cone activity begins color vision, but it does not fully explain after images. That requires opponent process theory. 29. Opponent process theory of color vision. Opponent process theory proposes that color is also processed in opposing channels, including red versus green, blue versus yellow, and light versus dark. Activation on one side of a channel inhibits the other side. If you stare at a red image and then look at a white surface, you may briefly see green. Prolonged activation fatigues part of the red-green system, allowing the opposing response to dominate when the stimulus is removed. Trichromatic theory describes the three cone types. Opponent process theory describes later neural organization. Modern color vision uses both explanations at different stages. 30. Afterimage. An afterimage is a visual experience that continues after the original stimulus has been removed. Negative color afterimages often appear in a complementary color because of opponent processing. Stare at a bright blue shape for several seconds, then shift your gaze to a white wall. A yellowish version may briefly appear. The shape is no longer present, but the visual system has not returned immediately to its neutral state. An afterimage is not light remaining on the wall. It is a temporary effect produced by adaptation within the visual system. 31. Color vision deficiency. Color vision deficiency is a reduced ability to distinguish certain colors due to one or more cone systems functioning differently or being absent. The most common inherited form makes it difficult to distinguish some reds and greens. A person may see two colored lines on a chart as nearly identical, even though others experience a clear difference. This does not usually mean the person sees only black and white. Many forms affect a limited range of color discrimination. Color vision deficiency is a more accurate term than assuming every affected person experiences complete color blindness. 32. Optic nerve. The optic nerve is the bundle of axons that carries visual information from the retina toward the brain. It is formed mainly by the axons of retinal ganglion cells. After the retina begins processing light, the resulting neural signals leave the eye through the optic nerve. From there, information travels through several brain pathways before contributing to conscious vision and visually guided action. The optic nerve carries neural information. It does not carry a tiny picture. The brain must interpret patterns of activity to construct the visual experience. 33. Prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia, sometimes called face blindness, is the difficulty of recognizing familiar faces despite otherwise normal vision. It can occur after brain injury or appear as a developmental condition. Someone with prosopagnosia may recognize a friend by voice, hairstyle, clothing, or the way the person walks, but not by the face alone. The problem is not forgetting that the friend exists. It involves the visual recognition system used to identify faces. Prosopagnosia shows that seeing a face and recognizing whose face it is are separate processes. 34. Blind sight. Blind sight is the ability to respond to visual information without consciously experiencing sight in part of the visual field, usually after damage to the primary visual cortex. A person may report seeing nothing in a particular area, but still point toward a light or estimate its location with better than chance accuracy. Visual information can reach brain pathways involved in action even when it does not produce normal conscious vision. Blind sight does not mean vision is fully restored. It shows that visual processing can influence behavior without entering conscious awareness in the usual way. Section 2. Review and transition vision begins when light reaches the retina, but the experience of seeing depends on several stages. The lens focuses. Rods and cones transduce light. Retinal cells begin processing. The optic nerve carries neural signals, and the brain builds color, detail, objects, and conscious experience from those patterns. Next, we move from light waves to sound waves and follow the path from vibration to hearing. Section 3. Hearing and auditory processing. Hearing requires a chain of mechanical and neural events. Vibrations move through the outer and middle ear, create waves inside the cochlea, bend sensory hair cells, and become patterns the brain interprets as pitch, loudness, location, speech, or music. 35. Sound wave. A sound wave is a pattern of vibration traveling through a medium such as air, water, or solid material. The vibration creates alternating regions of compression and rarefaction that carry energy outward from the source. When a speaker cone moves back and forth, it pushes and pulls nearby air molecules. Those changes travel across the room until they reach the ear. Sound waves are physical events. Hearing is the psychological experience the auditory system creates after detecting and interpreting those vibrations. 36. Frequency. Frequency is the number of complete wave cycles that occur each second. It is measured in hertz, with 1 hertz representing 1 cycle per second. A sound wave that completes more cycles per second has a higher frequency. One completing fewer cycles has a lower frequency. In human hearing, frequency is closely related to the experience of pitch. Frequency is the measurable physical property. Pitch is the way the auditory system experiences a sound as relatively high or low. 37. Pitch is the perceptual experience of how high or low a sound seems. It is influenced most strongly by the frequency of the sound wave. A small whistle generally produces a higher pitch sound than a large bass drum because its vibration occurs at a higher frequency. However, pitch is not identical to frequency. It is the brain's interpretation of frequency information. Frequency belongs to the sound wave. Pitch belongs to perception. Keeping that distinction clear prevents one of the most common mistakes in this section. 38. Amplitude. Amplitude is the height of a wave measured from its resting point. In sound, greater amplitude generally means the wave carries more energy and produces larger pressure changes. If you strike the same drum softly and then forcefully, the basic frequency may remain similar, but the stronger strike creates a wave with greater amplitude. Amplitude is a physical property of the sound wave. It contributes strongly to loudness, but perceived loudness also depends on frequency, distance, context, and the listener's sensitivity. 39. Loudness is the perceptual experience of a sound's intensity. It is related to amplitude and is commonly discussed using decibels, but perception does not increase in a perfectly simple one-to-one pattern. The same conversation may seem comfortably loud in a quiet room and difficult to hear beside heavy traffic. The physical sound interacts with background noise and the listener's auditory system. Amplitude describes the wave. Loudness describes the experience. Just as wavelength is not the same as color, amplitude is not exactly the same as what a person hears. 40. Tympanic membrane or eardrum. The tympanic membrane, commonly called the eardrum, is a thin membrane that vibrates when sound waves reach it. It separates the outer ear from the middle ear. Sound waves travel through the ear canal and create pressure changes against the membrane. Its movement transfers the vibration to the tiny bones of the middle ear. The eardrum does not interpret sound. It is part of the mechanical pathway that carries vibration from the air toward the sensory structures of the inner ear. 41. Ossicles. The ossicles are three tiny bones in the middle ear called the malleus, incus, and stapes. They transmit and amplify vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear. When the eardrum moves, the ossicles move in sequence. The stapes then pushes against the oval window of the cochlea, creating movement in the inner ear fluid. The names are often translated as hammer, anvil, and stirrup because of their shapes. Together, these bones form a mechanical bridge between the vibrating eardrum and the fluid-filled cochlea. 42. Cochlea. The cochlea is the spiral-shaped, fluid-filled structure in the inner ear where sound vibrations are converted into neural signals. It contains the basilar membrane and sensory hair cells. Movement from the stapes creates waves in the cochlear fluid. Those waves move different parts of the basilar membrane, bending the hair cells. The cochlea is where hearing becomes transduction. Mechanical vibration enters the inner ear, and receptor activity begins the neural message that will travel toward the brain. 43. Basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is a flexible structure running through the cochlea. Different regions respond most strongly to different sound frequencies. High-frequency sounds create their greatest movement near the base of the cochlea. Lower-frequency sounds reach peak movement farther along the membrane. Hair cells positioned in those regions respond when the membrane moves. This frequency-based organization helps the auditory system separate a complex sound into its components, much like identifying individual notes within a chord. 44. Hair cells. Hair cells are sensory receptors in the inner ear that convert mechanical movement into neural activity. When sound causes the basilar membrane to move, tiny projections on the hair cells bend, triggering changes in electrical signaling. Repeated exposure to extremely loud sound can damage these cells. In humans, damaged auditory hair cells do not normally regenerate, which is why long-term noise exposure can create permanent hearing loss. Hair cells do not grow like hair on the head. Their name comes from the small hair-like structures that respond to movement. 45. Place theory. Place theory explains pitch perception by proposing that different frequencies activate different places along the basilar membrane. It is especially useful for explaining how the perception of higher frequency sounds works. A high musical note produces its greatest movement near one region of the cochlea, while a lower note produces peak movement farther along the membrane. The brain uses the location of maximum activity as information about pitch. Place theory answers the question, where is the membrane responding most strongly? Other theories help explain how timing also contributes to pitch. 46. Frequency. Frequency theory proposes that the firing rate of auditory nerve activity matches the frequency of a sound wave. It is most useful for explaining lower frequency sounds. If a tone vibrates 100 times per second, neurons may produce a corresponding pattern of about 100 impulses per second. The brain can use that timing pattern to estimate pitch. Frequency theory focuses on when neurons fire. Place theory focuses on where the basilar membrane responds. The auditory system uses both timing and place information rather than relying on only one mechanism. 47. Volley theory. Volley theory explains how groups of auditory neurons can work together to represent frequencies that are too fast for a single neuron to match on its own. Individual neurons take turns firing, so their combined activity follows the sound's rhythm. Imagine several people passing a task back and forth because no one can repeat it quickly enough on their own. Each neuron fires only on some cycles, but the group produces a coordinated pattern. Volley theory extends frequency theory to higher frequencies by showing how populations of neurons can share the timing view. 48. Sound localization. Sound localization is the ability to determine where a sound is coming from. The brain compares information arriving at the two ears, especially tiny differences in timing and intensity. If a dog barks to your left, the sound usually reaches the left ear slightly earlier and more strongly than the right. The difference may be extremely small, but the brain uses it to estimate direction. Turning your head can add new information and make the location easier to judge. Sound localization depends on comparison across the ears, not one ear working alone. 49. Conductive hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss occurs when sound is not transmitted effectively through the outer or middle ear. The problem may involve the ear canal, eardrum, or ossicles, rather than the sensory receptors themselves. A buildup of fluid behind the eardrum can reduce the movement reaching the cochlea. Sounds may become quieter or muffled, even though the inner ear can still respond when enough vibration reaches it. Depending on the cause, medical treatment or hearing aids may improve conductive hearing loss by restoring or increasing the sound reaching the cochlea. 50. Sensorineural hearing loss. Sensorineural hearing loss results from damage to the hair cells in the cochlea, the auditory nerve, or related inner ear structures. Aging, disease, genetics, and repeated exposure to loud noise all contribute. Unlike many conductive problems, simply making sound louder may not restore clear hearing because the sensory system has difficulty converting or carrying the information. Hearing aids can help some people, and cochlear implants may help certain individuals with severe loss. Conductive loss disrupts sound transmission. Sensorineural loss disrupts sensory or neural processing. Section 3, Review and transition hearing begins with a sound wave, but depends on a coordinated pathway. The eardrum vibrates. The ossicles transfer the movement. Fluid moves inside the cochlea. Hair cells transduce that movement, and the nervous system represents frequency through place and timing patterns. Vision and hearing receive a great deal of attention, but they are only part of the sensory picture. Next, we turn to smell, taste, touch, pain, balance, and body position. Section 4, Chemical, Body, and Pain. Senses. These systems help us detect chemicals in the air and food, monitor environmental exposure, recognize potential injury, maintain balance, and determine the body's positoi, even when we cannot see it. 51. Olfaction. Olfaction is the sense of smell. Airborne chemical molecules enter the nasal cavity, dissolve in mucus, and bind to receptor cells near the top of the nose. When you smell coffee brewing from another room, molecules from the coffee activate patterns of olfactory receptors. The brain interprets the combined pattern as a recognizable odor. Smell has especially strong connections with brain regions involved in emotion and memory. That helps explain why an odor can produce a vivid feeling or memory before you consciously identify where you first encountered it. 52. Pheromones. Pheromones are chemical signals released by one member of a species that influence the behavior or physiology of other members of the same species. Their effects are well documented in many animals. For example, insects may use pheromones to mark a trail, signal danger, or coordinate mating behavior. The receiving animal detects the chemical information and responds in a predictable way. Claims about human pheromones should be treated cautiously. Odors can influence human social judgments, but researchers have not identified a single human chemical signal that governs attraction as advertisements often suggest. 53. Gustation. Gustation is the sense of taste. Food chemicals dissolve in saliva and interact with receptor cells located mainly within taste buds. When you eat a strawberry, taste receptors respond to chemical features such as sweetness and acidity. Smell, texture, temperature, and expectation then combine with taste to create the fuller experience of flavor. Gustation refers specifically to taste system activity. Flavor is a multisensory perception. This is why holding your nose can reduce the richness of food without removing every basic taste. 54. Basic tastes. Basic tastes are distinct categories of gustatory experience produced by different receptor mechanisms. The 5 widely established categories are sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. The current AP psychology framework also includes oleogustus, a taste associated with free fatty acids. Sweetness can signal energy-rich carbohydrates. Saltiness helps detect sodium. Sourness is related to acidity. Bitterness can help identify potentially harmful substances. Umami is associated with amino acids such as glutamate. Taste categories are not separate regions of the tongue. Receptors for multiple tastes are distributed across areas containing taste buds. 55. Supertaster. A supertaster is a person who experiences certain tastes, especially bitterness, more intensely than the average person. Supertasters often have a high density of taste-related structures on the tongue and may respond strongly to compounds used in taste testing. Foods such as black coffee, grapefruit, or some green vegetables may taste unusually bitter. That experience can influence food preferences, but it does not make someone objectively better at every form of tasting. Super refers to intensity of taste experience, not superior judgment, or a more refined personality. 56. Somatosensation. Somatosensation is the broad sensory system that provides information from the skin, muscles, joints, and internal tissues. It includes experiences such as touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, pain, and body position. When you reach into a bag without looking and identify your keys, somatosensory information helps you detect edges, texture, pressure, and movement. Several receptor types contribute different pieces of information. Touch is not a single sense located in a single type of receptor. It is a collection of body-based sensory processes that the brain integrates. 57. Nociception. Nociception is the neural process of detecting potentially damaging stimulation. Specialized receptors respond to extreme heat, intense pressure, irritating chemicals, or tissue injury, and send warning signals toward the nervous system. Touching a hot pan activates nociceptors and can trigger a rapid withdrawal response. The experience of pain usually follows, but nociception and pain are not identical. Nociception refers to the detection and neural signaling of pain. Pain is the conscious experience shaped by those signals along with attention, emotion, expectations, and context. 58. Gate control theory. Gate control theory proposes that pain signals can be increased or reduced by a gating mechanism in the spinal cord, while messages from the brain can also influence how open or closed that gate becomes. After bumping your elbow, you may instinctively rub the area. Touch and pressure signals can compete with pain-related activity, reducing the pain you experience. Attention, fear, and expectation can also change pain through descending brain pathways. The theory explains why pain is not a direct measure of tissue damage. Neural competition and psychological context can change what reaches awareness. 59. Phantom limb. Sensation. Phantom limb sensation is the experience of feeling that an amputated or missing limb is still present. The sensation may involve pressure, movement, itching, temperature, or pain. A person may feel as though a missing hand is tightly clenched, even though the hand is no longer there. The nervous system and brain maps associated with that body part can remain active and reorganize after amputation. Phantom sensations are real perceptual experiences. They show that body awareness is constructed by the nervous system rather than produced solely by the tissues currently present. 60. Vestibular sense. The vestibular sense provides information about balance, head movement, and spatial orientation. Its receptors are located in structures of the inner ear. When an elevator begins moving or a car turns sharply, vestibular receptors help signal acceleration and changes in head position. The brain combines that information with vision and body sense signals to maintain balance. When the systems disagree, dizziness or motion sickness can occur. Reading in a moving car, for example, may give the eyes a stable page while the inner ear detects movement. 61. Semicircular canals. The semicircular canals are 3 fluid-filled loops in the inner ear that detect rotational movement of the head. Each canal is oriented in a different plane. When you turn your head, the fluid lags slightly behind and bends receptor structures inside the canals. The resulting neural activity indicates the direction and speed of rotation. After spinning and stopping suddenly, the fluid may continue moving briefly. That lingering activity helps explain why the room can seem to keep turning, even after your body has stopped. 62. Kinesthesis. Kinesthesis is the sense of the position and movement of individual body parts. Receptors in muscles, tendons, and joints provide information that allows movement without constant visual monitoring. It is closely related to what is often called proprioception. Close your eyes and raise one arm. You still know roughly where the arm is because the body sends information about muscle stretch and joint position. The vestibular sense tracks balance and movement of the head and body as a whole. Kinesthesis tracks where particular body parts are and how they are moving. Section 4. Review and transition. These senses rarely operate alone. Smell combines with taste to produce flavor. Vision works with vestibular and kinesthetic information to support balance and movement. Nociception supplies warnings, while attention and context shape the resulting pain. Now we move from individual sensory systems to the organizing rules the brain uses when turning separate details into a meaningful whole. Section 5. Perceptual processing and Gestalt organization. Perception is not a passive copy of sensory input. The brain works from the incoming details, applies prior knowledge and expectations, and groups separate elements into objects and patterns. Gestalt principles describe several of the shortcuts built into that organization. 63. Bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing begins with sensory input and builds toward a complete perception. Basic features such as color, edges, pitch, or pressure are detected first and then combined into more complex forms. If you encounter an unfamiliar object, you may examine its lines, texture, size, and moving parts before deciding what it could be. The interpretation grows from the available details. Bottom-up processing is data-driven. It starts with what the sensory receptors provide, rather than beginning with a strong expectation about what the object should be. 64. Top-down processing. Top-down processing uses prior knowledge, expectations, context, and goals to interpret sensory information. The brain does not wait for every detail before forming a likely explanation. You can often read a sentence with a missing or unclear letter because the surrounding words help you predict what belongs there. The sensory information is incomplete, but your knowledge of language fills the gap. Top-down processing is concept-driven. It makes perception faster and more efficient, but it can also cause errors when expectations are wrong. 65. Schema. A schema is a mental framework that organizes knowledge and guides expectations. Schemas influence perception by helping the brain determine what information is likely to belong in a given situation. Your classroom schema may include desks, an instructor, a board, and students taking notes. When you enter a new classroom, that framework helps you quickly interpret the scene. Schemas make perception efficient, but they can also direct attention toward expected details and away from unexpected ones. The framework helps organize experience, yet it can also bias what you believe you saw. 66. Perceptual set. A perceptual set is a readiness or predisposition to perceive a stimulus in a particular way. Expectations created by instructions, recent experiences, emotion, or context can push an ambiguous image toward one interpretation. If people are told that a blurry picture contains an animal, they may search for ears, legs, or a tail. If another group expects a vehicle, they may organize the same marks differently. A schema is a broader framework of knowledge. A perceptual set is the immediate expectation that prepares you for one interpretation. 67. Context effects. Context effects occur when surrounding information changes how a stimulus is perceived. The same central symbol can look like a letter when placed among letters and a number when placed among numbers. The physical mark does not change. What changes is the information around it and the interpretation that seems most likely. Context can influence vision, speech perception, emotion, and social judgment. Perception depends not only on the isolated stimulus, but also on the pattern, setting, and expectations in which that stimulus appears.
68. Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology is an approach emphasizing that people naturally organize sensory elements into meaningful wholes. The complete pattern is experienced as more than a collection of separate pieces. A melody remains recognizable when played in a different key, even though every individual note changes. What stays meaningful is the relationship among the notes. Gestalt psychologists studied the organizing tendencies that give rise to patterns, figures, and objects from sensory information. The central idea is that perception depends on structure and relationships, not only on isolated sensations. 69. Figure-ground relationship. The figure-ground relationship is the tendency to separate a visual scene into a main object, called the figure, and the surrounding background, called the ground. When you read this sentence, the dark letters become the figure, and the page becomes the ground. In an ambiguous image, those roles can reverse, causing a person to alternate between two different perceptions. The sensory information may remain unchanged while attention shifts to which region stands out. Figure-ground organization helps the brain decide what object to focus on and what to treat as background. 70. Proximity. Proximity is the Gestalt principle that elements located near one another tend to be perceived as belonging together. Imagine 12 dots arranged in 4 tight groups. Even if all the dots look identical, the spacing makes them appear as 4 clusters rather than 12 unrelated marks.
Designers use proximity to show which label belongs with which image or which items form one section. The brain uses physical closeness as a cue that separate elements are related. 71. Similarity. Similarity is the Gestalt principle that elements sharing visual features tend to be grouped together. Color, shape, size, texture, or orientation can all create perceived categories. On a crowded calendar, every blue appointment may seem related even when the blue items are not next to one another. Their shared color overrides some of the spacing information. Proximity groups elements because they are close. Similarity groups them because they look alike. When the principles compete, the strength of each visual cue affects the final organization. 72. Closure is the tendency to fill in missing parts of an incomplete image so it is perceived as a complete object. A circle drawn with several small gaps is usually still seen as a circle. The visual system supplies the missing connections rather than experiencing disconnected curved lines. Closure helps people recognize objects when part of the view is blocked or missing. It also demonstrates that perception includes information the stimulus did not fully provide. The brain favors a stable, complete form when the available pieces support one. 73. Continuity or good continuation. Continuity, also called good continuation, is the Gestalt principle that lines and patterns are usually perceived as following the smoothest continuous path. When two lines cross, people normally see two continuous lines passing through one another rather than four short lines meeting at a point. The smoother organization is easier for the visual system to maintain. Continuity helps us follow roads, borders, and partially hidden edges. The brain assumes that a pattern continues in a consistent direction unless strong evidence suggests otherwise. Section 5. Review and transition. Bottom-up processing provides the details. Top-down processing supplies expectations. Gestalt principles organize those details into figures, groups, and complete forms. Together, these processes help explain why perception feels immediate, even though the brain is actively constructing it. The next question is how a two-dimensional image on the retina becomes a world that appears three-dimensional, stable, and full of movement. Section 6. Depth, constancy, and motion. Each retina receives a flat pattern of light, yet we experience distance and depth. Objects also seem to maintain their size, shape, and color as conditions change. These terms explain the cues and constancies that make that possible. 74. Depth perception. Depth perception is the ability to experience the world in 3 dimensions and judge the distance of objects. The brain combines information from both eyes with cues available to either eye alone. When you reach for a cup, depth perception helps estimate how far your hand must move. When you drive, it helps judge the distance and speed of other vehicles. The retinal image itself is 2-dimensional. The experience of depth is constructed from multiple cues, including differences between the eyes, eye muscle activity, perspective, texture, overlap, and relative size. 75. Retinal disparity. Retinal disparity is the slight difference between the images projected onto the 2 retinas, because the eyes view the world from different positions. The brain compares those images to estimate depth. Hold one finger close to your face and alternate closing each eye. The finger appears to shift against the background because each eye sees it from a different angle. The closer the object, the greater the disparity tends to be. Retinal disparity is a binocular cue, meaning it depends on information from both eyes. 76. Convergence. Convergence is a binocular depth cue based on the inward turning of the eyes when focusing on a nearby object. The brain uses feedback from the eye muscles to estimate distance. Bring a pencil slowly toward your nose. Your eyes rotate inward more strongly as the pencil gets closer. The amount of muscular adjustment provides a cue that the object is near. Convergence and retinal disparity both require 2 eyes. They are most useful for judging objects at relatively close distances. 77. Relative clarity. Relative clarity is a monocular depth cue in which hazy or less detailed objects are usually perceived as farther away than sharper objects. The atmosphere scatters light over long distances, reducing contrast and detail. In a landscape, distant mountains may appear pale and bluish, while nearby trees look crisp and richly colored. Even in a flat photograph, the difference creates a strong sense of depth. Relative clarity can operate with one eye because it depends on information available within a single image. 78. Relative size. Relative size is a monocular depth cue in which the smaller retinal image of two objects assumed to be similar in actual size is perceived as farther away. If two people of roughly equal height stand at different distances, the farther person creates a smaller image on the retina. The brain interprets the difference as distance rather than assuming the person physically shrank. Relative size works best when the objects are expected to have similar real-world dimensions. Without that assumption, retinal size alone can be misleading. 79. Texture gradient. Texture gradient is a monocular depth cue in which nearby surface details appear larger, clearer, and more widely spaced, while distant details appear smaller and more densely packed. Look down a brick walkway. The nearest bricks have visible edges and gaps. Farther away, the pattern becomes finer and eventually blends into a more uniform surface. The gradual change in texture provides information about distance and the slope of a surface. Artists use the same cue to create depth on a flat page. 80. Linear perspective. Linear perspective is a monocular depth cue in which parallel lines appear to move closer together as they extend into the distance. Railroad tracks are parallel, but from the right perspective, they appear to converge near the horizon. The brain interprets that apparent narrowing as evidence of increasing distance. Painters and photographers use linear perspective to create a three-dimensional scene on a two-dimensional surface. The lines do not actually meet. Their changing visual angle produces the perception of depth. 81. Interposition. Interposition is a monocular depth cue in which an object blocking part of another object is perceived as closer. It is also called occlusion. If one student stands in front of another and hides part of the second student's body, the visual system interprets the blocking student as nearer. The cue does not reveal the exact distance, but it establishes an order. Interposition is especially powerful because objects in the physical world cannot normally occupy the same space. The object doing the blocking must be in front. 82. Perceptual constancy. Perceptual constancy is the tendency to experience familiar objects as relatively stable, even when the sensory information reaching the receptors changes. Important forms include size, shape, and color constancy. As a friend walks away, the retinal image becomes smaller. As a door opens, its retinal shape changes. As lighting shifts, the wavelengths reflected from an object change. Yet the friend, door, and object usually seem to remain stable. Constancy allows perception to track the world's enduring properties rather than treating every change in viewing conditions as a new object.
83. Size constancy. Size constancy is the tendency to perceive an object's size as stable even when its retinal image becomes larger or smaller because its distance changes. When a car drives away, it creates a progressively smaller image on the retina. You do not normally conclude that the car is physically shrinking. Depth cues tell the brain that the distance is changing. Size perception depends on both retinal image size and estimated distance. When distance cues are distorted, size illusions can occur because the brain applies its normal assumptions to an unusual scene. 84. Shape constancy. Shape constancy is the tendency to perceive an object's shape as stable even when the angle of view changes the shape projected onto the retina. A rectangular door creates a more trapezoidal retinal image as it swings open.
You still perceive one rigid rectangular door rather than an object changing its physical shape. The visual system uses context and knowledge about solid objects to interpret the changing image. Shape constancy helps maintain a stable world, while you or the object moves. 85. Color constancy. Color constancy is the tendency to perceive an object's color as relatively stable under different lighting conditions. The wavelengths reflected from a surface can change substantially between sunlight, shade, and indoor light. A white sheet of paper still appears white in a warmly lit room, even though the light reaching your eyes contains more yellow. The brain compares the paper with surrounding surfaces and adjusts for the likely illumination. Color constancy is useful, but it can also contribute to disagreement when an image contains ambiguous lighting cues. 86. Apparent motion, including the phi phenomenon. Apparent motion is the perception of movement when stationary images or lights are presented in a carefully timed sequence. The phi phenomenon is a classic example in which adjacent lights flashing on and off appear to create one moving light. Movies also rely on rapidly presented still frames to produce a continuous experience of action. Nothing moves within any single frame, but the sequence is perceived as motion. Apparent motion shows that the brain infers movement from changes across time. Perceived motion can exist even when no single object physically travels along the path you experience. Section 6. Review and transition depth cues help the brain build distance from a flat retinal image. Constancies help objects remain stable as distance, angle, and lighting change. Apparent motion shows that the brain can also construct movement from a timed sequence of stationary events. Our final section asks a different question. With so much sensory information available, how does the brain decide what enters awareness, and what can disappear when attention is elsewhere? Section 7. Attention and failures of awareness. Attention is selective by necessity. Focusing on a single source of information improves processing, but it also makes other information easier to miss. The final 4 terms reveal the strengths and limits of that filtering system. 87. Selective attention. Selective attention is the process of focusing conscious awareness on one source of information while filtering competing stimulation. The brain cannot fully process every sight, sound, sensation, and thought at once. In a busy classroom, you may focus on the instructor's voice while tuning out hallway noise, the movement of students, and the pressure of your clothing. Some of that information still reaches the sensory systems, but it does not receive the same level of processing. Selective attention helps manage limited mental resources. The cost is that unattended information can be overlooked, even when it appears directly in front of us. 88. Cocktail party effect. The cocktail party effect is the ability to focus on one conversation in a noisy environment while still noticing personally meaningful information from another conversation, such as your own name. At a crowded event, you may follow the speaker and hear nearby voices as background noise. Then, someone across the room says your name, and your attention shifts immediately. The effect suggests that unattended information may receive some processing before it is fully filtered out. Attention is selective, but the boundary is not perfectly sealed. 89. Inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is the failure to notice a visible, unexpected object because attention is focused elsewhere. In a famous demonstration, viewers count basketball passes, and many fail to notice a person in a gorilla costume walking through the scene. The image reaches the eyes, but the unexpected event does not enter conscious awareness. Inattentional blindness is not a vision problem. It is an attention problem. Looking directly at something does not guarantee that you will consciously perceive it when your limited attention is committed elsewhere. 90. Change. Blindness. Change. Blindness is the failure to notice a change in a visual scene, especially when the change occurs during a brief interruption, distraction, eye movement, or cut. Two nearly identical photographs may alternate with a blank screen, and a major object can disappear unnoticed for several seconds. In real life, a person may also miss that an object was moved while attention was interrupted. Inattentional blindness involves failing to notice an unexpected object that is present. Change blindness involves failing to notice that something in the scene has changed.
Final review. That completes all 90 terms in sensation and perception. The larger pattern is that experience is built in stages. Sensory receptors detect physical energy. Transduction converts it into neural activity. The brain organizes that activity using attention, context, prior knowledge, and perceptual rules. Vision is not only light reaching the retina. Hearing is not only vibration reaching the ear. Flavor is not only taste. Pain is not a perfect measurement of tissue damage. And looking directly at something does not guarantee that it will enter awareness. Sensation gives the nervous system information. Perception turns that information into the world you consciously experience. If you are studying, return to the section you need and try explaining each term without reading the definition. Then create a new example. If you can recognize the same process in a different situation, you are moving beyond memorization and into real understanding. If this video helped you, subscribe to the Psychology Notebook and tell me in the comments which term surprised you most or which psychology topic you want to see next. The next video in this series on terminology will move into clinical psychology and therapy, including the major approaches psychologists use to understand and treat psychological concerns. Thank you for studying with the Psychology Notebook. Want a better way to learn psychology? I created a free visual psychology starter guide to help you see how the major ideas connect. Inside, you'll find 25 illustrated psychology flashcards, colorful visual maps, and beginner-friendly explanations covering the brain, memory, learning, personality, development, and more. Whether you're taking a psychology class or just curious about how people think and behave, this guide gives you a simple place to start. Download your free copy using the link in the description. Thank you for learning with me, and according to YouTube, this video is perfect for you on your learning journey. Click it and I'll see you over there.